Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to get into a case that I think really shook folks up back in the 70s and 80s.
Sure.
And it's one of those cases that makes you wonder, about human nature. Like, what are people capable of?
hmm
And I think it really kind of gets under your skin.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that is really fascinating, I think, because on the surface you have this image of, just this average person, a woman devoted to her family, someone who's active in her church, the kind of person you'd see in the grocery store and never think twice about, but under the surface was just this darkness, this capacity for violence and evil that's really hard to comprehend.
It is. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today. And we've got a lot to go through. We've got court documents, interviews with Velma's children,
Mm.
even excerpts from her memoir that she wrote on death row. We're going to go through all of it and try to understand what led her down this path.
Yeah, and as you know, it's never just one thing, right? There's always
Yeah.
a story behind the story.
Ex-
And I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. We're not just rehashing old headlines, we're really digging in and trying to understand the psychology and the sociology that contributed to all of this. And in Velma's case, it all seems to go back to her childhood, which was, to put it mildly, very difficult.
Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah.
So Velma was born in 1932 in the middle of the Depression in rural North Carolina. And her father, Murphy Bullard, was a farmer and by all accounts a very angry and volatile man.
Right.
Velma described him as abusive, both physically and emotionally.
hmm
She talks about how he would just fly into these rages and even take it out on furniture.
Yeah, I mean, that's, that image of a child, witnessing this kind of uncontrolled rage and aggression.
Yeah.
You never know when the next outburst is going to happen or who it's going to be directed at. It's going to be terrifying.
And you have to imagine how that shapes, a young child's mind, right?
Yeah.
You're learning about the world, about relationships, and your main example for masculinity, for how to handle conflict and stress, is this just out-of-control rage monster.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and often what happens, with children is they internalize those behaviors and they learn that anger and aggression are ways to, get what you want and to exert control. And in Velma's case, it really seems like that's exactly what happened.
Right, but there's another layer to this, too, because her mother, Lily, wasn't physically abusive herself, but it seems like she enabled Murphy's behavior,
Right.
always trying to appease him and play down his outbursts. And I'm sure that felt like a betrayal to young Velma.
Absolutely. I mean, it's that classic dynamic you see, right? One parent's the abuser, the other parent is complicit by not doing anything. And for a child, that's incredibly confusing and damaging because, not only are they being abused, but they're also learning that the people who are supposed to protect them just can't or won't.
Yeah, and so, we're starting to see this complex web of factors in Velma's childhood.
Yeah.
Right? You've got the poverty, the instability of the depression, and you layer on top of that this really volatile, abusive home environment and a mother who, for whatever reason, just couldn't or wouldn't step in.
Right. And it's important to say, that none of this excuses her behavior later in life.
Of course not.
But it does provide some context, it helps us understand what she was dealing with psychologically. And it's important to remember that these early experiences, these traumas, they don't just go away. They stay with you and they have an impact on how you see the world, how you form relationships, how you cope with stress and adversity.
So she's growing up in this really dysfunctional environment, right? And she's trying to find ways to survive, to cope.
Mm.
And one of the ways she did that, it seems, was through school. Velma was a bright student. She excelled academically, but she still struggled socially.
Yeah, and you can imagine how difficult it would have been for her to fit in. She's coming from this impoverished background. She's carrying all this emotional baggage. She probably felt like an outsider, different from her classmates. And teachers at the time, they noted that she had these angry outbursts and really had trouble controlling her emotions.
It's almost like that anger, that rage that she saw at home became her default, setting her go-to response anytime she felt threatened or overwhelmed.
Exactly. And sadly, that continued into her adult life. When she was 17, she impulsively married Thomas Burke. It seemed like an escape from that turbulent home life, at least on the surface.
Right, so let's talk about that marriage and how it really set the stage for the next chapter of Velma's life
Okay.
and her story.
Okay. It's interesting because for a while it seemed like, things were going well for her. She found some stability with Thomas. They had 2 children together, Ronnie and Kim. And from everything we know, it was a relatively happy time. Even her relationship with her parents seemed to improve.
Yeah, well, she finally caught a break.
Yeah, a moment of calm before the storm.
Yeah.
But you're right, it didn't last.
It didn't.
And there are a few things that seem to have happened that really changed things for Velma and sent her down this dark path. One of them was a hysterectomy that she had in the early 60s. Now we know that, major surgeries like that can really mess with your hormones and your mental well-being. But back then, people didn't really understand that as much.
Yeah, and you also have to think about, the stigma surrounding mental health back then,
Yeah.
especially in a place like rural North Carolina where Velma lived.
Yeah.
It just wasn't something people talked about or sought help for.
Right, exactly. So she's dealing with all these, emotional swings and potential hormonal imbalances, and she doesn't have any healthy way to deal with it. No one to talk to, no support system. And around the same time, her husband Thomas starts drinking heavily.
Oh, so it's like everything is falling apart.
Yeah, it's like this perfect storm.
Yeah.
She's struggling internally, and then her external world starts to crumble too. And this is something we see over and over again with Velma. This combination of internal turmoil and external stress. And she's trying to cope, but the only tools she has are the ones she learned in childhood. Anger manipulation, blaming others, and those are not good tools to
Yeah,
have.
they're not. And they're going to lead to some really tragic consequences. So how do these coping mechanisms start to show up in her relationship with Thomas?
Well, as Thomas's drinking got worse, he became abusive. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because she's reliving the trauma of her own childhood, but this time she's the one being abused.
Wow.
So how does she respond? Well, in a way that you might not expect. Instead of leaving the abusive relationship, she tries to control it. She tries to control Thomas, tries to manage his drinking. She even checks him into rehab. But all this time, she's neglecting her own mental and emotional health, and she starts taking painkillers to numb the pain, but she ends up getting addicted, and that's going to have some terrible consequences down the line.
It's like she's stuck in this awful cycle.
Right.
She's trying to fix the external problem, her husband's drinking, but she's not dealing with her own internal issues, the unresolved trauma that's driving her behavior.
Exactly. And then things took a very dark turn in 1969 when Thomas dies in a house fire. The official ruling was accidental death. He fell asleep with a lit cigarette, but there were some suspicious circumstances. And Velma's reaction to his death was really disturbing.
Yeah, she seemed very detached, almost cold. Obviously she's devastated, but she seemed more focused on the life insurance payout and getting her life back on track than actually grieving Thomas.
Yeah, that's a big part of Velma's personality, this inability to process grief and trauma. It's like she just shuts down those feelings, buries them deep down inside, and eventually they're going to come out in some very destructive ways.
So within a year of Thomas's death, she marries Jennings Barfield, the husband of her recently deceased best friend. Which, that's pretty strange.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a decision that raised some eyebrows. And even Velma admitted later on that she wasn't really in love with Jennings. It was more about filling a void, finding someone to take care of her, to provide that sense of security that she craved.
This marriage, like the one before, it didn't go well. Jennings had a lot of health problems, emphysema, diabetes. And Velma, who was already dealing with her own issues, became resentful of having to take care of him.
Right, and here we see those same patterns emerging. The stress, the resentment, the reliance on medication to cope. It's a recipe for disaster.
And it was a disaster because in 1971, Jennings dies suddenly. And at first, his death is blamed on his health problems, but the truth is much darker. Velma poisoned him.
Yeah, this is where Velma crosses a line from which there's no turning back. This seemingly devoted wife, overwhelmed by her husband's illness, becomes a killer. And what's even more disturbing is that this is just the beginning. This act of murder is going to be the first of many more to come.
So let's talk about those other victims and how Velma managed to hide her deadly secret for so long.
It's crazy how she got away with it for so long, but this was the 70s, Forensic science wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today.
Yeah, they didn't have all the fancy DNA testing and stuff back then.
Exactly. And Velma was smart about it. She targeted people who were already sick or elderly people whose deaths wouldn't raise too many red flags,
It's just awful. She was taking advantage of the most vulnerable people, the people who relied on her for care.
It is.
Yeah.
It's one of the most disturbing parts of this whole case, this total betrayal of trust.
So tell me about the other victims.
Well, the first one was her own mother, Lily Bullard.
Wow.
Velma had moved back in with her after Jennings died, and within a few months, Lily was dead. Officially, it was heart failure, but they later found out that Velma had been giving her tea laced with arsenic.
Poisoning her own mother. It's just unbelievable.
It is, and it didn't stop there. Next was Dolly Edwards, an elderly woman Velma was hired to care for. Then there was John Henry Lee, an older man who was living with Velma and her kids. Both of them died under suspicious circumstances, and both of them had been poisoned with arsenic.
Unbelievable. I mean, the whole time she's putting on this act,
Yeah.
the grieving widow, the caring caretaker. It's almost like she had a split personality or something.
Yeah, it really shows a complete lack of empathy, you know?
No,
She
no.
just couldn't connect with the suffering she was causing. In her mind, she wasn't killing these people. She was just removing obstacles,
Yeah,
solving problems.
problems.
Right.
But eventually her luck ran out. In 1976, she got back together with an old boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. And this relationship was different from the others. It seemed like Velma might have actually had real feelings for Stuart. But those same old patterns, the destructive behavior, it all came back.
Yeah, it's like she couldn't escape her past no matter how hard she tried. She was drawn to these toxic relationships where she could be in control, where she could manipulate and deceive.
And the relationship with Stuart was really rocky. A lot of fighting money problems. Velma was desperate to keep things from falling apart, so she started forging checks from Stuart's account.
And when he found out what she was doing, her response was to poison him, just like she had done to all the others. But this time was different. Stuart was younger and healthier than her other victims. And his family, they didn't trust Velma, so they insisted on an autopsy.
And that's what did it.
Yeah, that's when it all came crashing down. The autopsy showed that Stuart had been poisoned with arsenic. And that's when the police started looking into Velma's past. They dug up bodies, and the whole truth came out.
It must have been a huge shock to everyone who knew her.
It was. It was national news. People couldn't believe that this ordinary woman, this grandmother, could have done such horrible things.
So in 1978, Velma Barfield was arrested and charged with Stuart Taylor's murder. And her trial was a big media circus. The prosecutors said she was a cold-blooded killer, and the defense argued that she was mentally ill, that she was driven to these crimes by all the trauma and addiction in her life.
Right. It's that age-old question, nature versus nurture. Are we responsible for our own actions, or are we products of our environment?
It's a really tough question. And in Velma's case, the jury decided that she was responsible. They found her guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. She was the first woman to be executed in the U.S. since 1962.
And that execution in 1984 really sparked a debate about capital punishment, especially for women. Was it really right to execute someone who might have been mentally ill, someone who had obviously suffered so much in her own life?
It's a really difficult question, and there are no easy answers. But there's another part of this story that makes it even more complicated. While she was on death row, Velma found religion, became a devout Christian, and said that she was sorry for what she had done.
Yeah, a lot of people wondered if it was real. Was she really remorseful, or was it just a way to try to avoid the death penalty?
It's impossible to say for sure what was going on in her mind. But what we do know is that her story continues to fascinate and disturb us. It forces us to look at the darkest parts of human nature and think about the complexities of mental illness addiction and the challenges of trying to find justice in a world where good and evil are often so closely intertwined.
And it leaves us with that haunting question. Can someone who's done such terrible things ever truly be redeemed?
Well, we hope you found this deep dive informative and thought-provoking. It's a case that really makes you think about what people are capable of. And we hope it's made you consider some of the bigger questions surrounding mental illness addiction and the justice system. We encourage you to keep exploring these topics, keep asking the tough questions, because that's how we learn, and that's how we create a better world.